Chapter 6. Everything works? Homeroom and computer lab time were no different than being in the B-Pod classes, thought Monte. His best friend Darren had once speculated that honors kids completed the same reading and math programs as regular kids, but they only had 15 seconds to complete each problem. Ever since Monte found out he was on track to join the honors program, Darren's comment had filled him with anxiety. Monte soon discovered that he had worried over nothing. Darren didn't know what he was talking about. Honors Kid had an unlimited amount of time to complete the problems. The reading passages were just longer, and they had calculators available for the math. Calculators? Monte said to himself as he reached into his class's bin. Yep, gotta love the honors program, remarked a classmate with a smirk on his face. Monte turned his head to the unfamiliar voice. We never had calculators in the B-Pod. What makes us so special that we get to use calculators now? Aren't we all in the same school getting ready for the same tests at the end of the year? Brandon twisted his face. Don't they have paper and pencil in the B-Pod, though? Brandon mocked Monte with air quotations. Sounds like they still have as good a chance to pass to me, he continued. Monte began to clench his fists. None of his friends had been sorted into other classes, had ever had the opportunity to use a calculator in class. We've always had calculators in the honors program. That's just the way it is for us. Suddenly, Bao stepped between Monte and Brandon to reach into the bin. Well, I'm just thankful for the help, he told them both. Brandon put his hands in his sand-colored khakis and walked away. Bao cupped his hand around his mouth and whispered, Don't sweat Brandon, Monte. He's been in the honors program since kindergarten, thanks to his parents and their Halloween heyday fundraiser for the school. He's not even that good of a reader. My dad talks about adults who talk like that, Bao. It's not right, man, Monte said, still eyeing Brandon as he walked away. The two boys took their seats next to one another at the computers. At least all the headsets seem to work in this pod, Monte murmured through his clenched teeth. Chapter 7. Differences. Montellis Dryerson Jr., the music teacher, Mrs. Satchmo called out. Here, Monte responded dryly. The kids sat on blue music notes, taped to a carpeted floor. Monte sat next to the xylophones and snare drums, breathing in the smell of old clarinets, while Mrs. Satchmo continued to call roll. Soothing trumpet sounds played through the speakers in the ceiling. I wonder what Darren, David, and my other friends from the neighborhood are up to, Monte thought to himself as he looked around at his peers. He was pretty sure his old friends weren't sitting quietly in a circle, smoothing wrinkles out of their heavily starched pants and crisp white button-downs. Maybe if I had stood in another line this morning, Mrs. Sheffield wouldn't have noticed. Nathalie? Here. Richard? Present. Monte immediately raised his hand and did a little bathroom dance on the floor in an attempt to get out of class and visit his friends on the other side of school. Mrs. Satchmo signaled he could go with a little shooing motion of her hand. Little did she know, Monte had no intention of using the restroom. In the hallway, Monte took it upon himself to pay a visit to the B-Pod on the other side of the school to see what his friends were up to. He peeked into doors as he approached the B-Pod, noting keyboards full of missing keys that stood out like missing teeth and headphones connected to mangled red and yellow exposed wires. Finally, he came to a closed door with the words, Miss Garcia, 4th grade, taped outside. Psst, Monte called out as he stood on his toes to peek into the classroom's L-shaped window. No one responded, but Monte didn't walk away. He was determined to make a face at one of the twins as they drifted in and out of attention to their work. While everyone scribbled answers into worksheets, Monte took note of the differences in the classroom. The walls were bare, and there certainly weren't any college pennants or desks grouped together to build a sense of community. Each of the 36 students crowded into Miss Garcia's classroom looked and dressed like Monte. They slouched in their single-filed rows, disinterested in their teacher who sat at her desk while she talked at them. There wasn't much of a mix of races or clothing styles, which seemed strange to Monte. There was no test to get into these classes, yet the B-Pod was even more homogeneous than the honors group. But the longer Monte scanned the room, the more he realized that his classmates had similarities to his current classmates beyond just being fourth graders. They held side conversations with one another and talked when the teacher wasn't looking. They daydreamed while staring out of the classroom window from time to time during instruction. But most obviously, they all came to school to make it to the next grade level, whether forced to by their parents or not. I still don't see what makes them so different from honors kids, other than that stupid test, Monte thought to himself. I can think of at least 3 other kids who are smarter than me in this class. Suddenly, Darren focused his attention on the door and spotted Monte. Immediately, he tapped David to share the unexpected visit from Monte. Their 3 faces lit up with excitement, as bright as if they hadn't seen each other since the beginning of summer. Monte twisted his face and flashed a loser sign made with his fingers at his friends. The 2 boys in class laughed and returned the gesture. "Darren and David?" shouted Mrs. Garcia. "Is there something funny you 2 would like to share with the class?" "Nah, Miss G," Darren replied, as his best friend ducked out of the window and was gone again. "Nothing's funny about this at all." As Monte made his way back to music class, hoping his bathroom break hadn't been too long, he scrunched his face up and thought to himself, I wonder what Mr. Wood is up to. Chapter 8. Unanswered Questions. It was clearly the first week of school because the bulletin boards in the hallway were busy with summer themes and welcome back quotes. There were snow cone sentence structures and marshmallow mixed fractions. Each teacher was responsible for a bulletin board near their classroom, and it was easy to tell which teachers put their best work into the boards and which teachers did not. The bulletin boards in the A-Pod were dripping with glitter and colorful construction paper. The bulletin boards in the B-Pod held simple white typing paper taped together that read, "Welcome back, students." When Monte made his way back to classroom 32, the door was closed. He stood on his tippy toes again and peeked through the L-shaped window only to find Mr. Wood pacing back and forth with a book he seemed to be writing in. Monte was shocked. He had never seen an adult write in a book. He had seen his peers writing in books over the years, but that act of rebellion was worth a referral in a parent-teacher conference. Monte raised his hand to knock on the door, then froze at the sound of a pair of high-heeled shoes making their way down the hallway towards him. "Mr. Drierson! Mr. Drierson!" It was Dr. Stiles, who had seen Monte wandering the halls when he should have been in class. Dumbfounded, Monte stood paralyzed, with his fist still raised to Mr. Wood's classroom door. Dr. Stiles' mood earrings flashed a fiery orange as she stalked towards him. At the last second, Mr. Wood opened his classroom door and greeted them both with his book and pen still in hand. "Is everything okay out here?" Dr. Stiles' earrings began to dim, but Monte knew he wasn't off the hook yet. "Mr. Drierson, did you not hear me call your name?" questioned the principals whose footsteps had attracted the eyes of students in neighboring classrooms. Monte turned slowly around as he had yet to face his fuming principal. "No, ma'am." The tone of Dr. Stiles' voice was sharp as she asked what he was up to while he took time away from Miss Satchmo's class. "I asked him to stop by," Mr. Wood interjected. Monte barely kept his jaw from dropping. A nervous thought flitted through his mind. What if Mr. Wood was caught? Could teachers get detention? He stared at Dr. Stiles, silently begging the universe to make her believe Mr. Wood. She crossed her arms. Her earrings shone. "Is that so?" she asked. He and Mr. Wood nodded, quick, in agreement. Well then, Monte, since you're here, she paused dramatically, I wanted to congratulate you on making it into the honors program. You'll have to keep your eye on this one, Mr. Wood. For a second, Monte thought she was going to call him out as a troublemaker, but she continued with a smile. He's quick to pick up on things and has a supportive family like none other at home. Mr. Wood smiled and said, well, it looks like his support system just got a bit stronger here with his Three Pyramids elementary family. Three of them smiled, though Monte felt a bit cringy inside. This feeling typically took over him when someone made him feel like he was the most special person in the room. Monte wasn't a big fan of mushy feelings. Dr. Stiles turned and sauntered away, and Mr. Wood invited Monte into his classroom. Couldn't get enough of me, eh, King Monte? Monte stopped in his tracks, cocked his head back, and asked, how'd you know my name is King Monte? Well, when I saw you in the cafeteria this morning, I thought your name was Montellis. But with a shirt like that, he nodded at Monte's ferocious crowned lion, I thought no. This young man thinks of himself as a king. He is a king, as far as I'm concerned. Monte was speechless. He'd never heard anyone outside of his family call him King Monte, especially a teacher. No teacher had ever spoken to him in such a way. Most of the other young black men Monte had interacted with either insulted or intimidated each other. Mr. Wood placed his hand on Monte's shoulder, and a more stoic look came over his face. Why'd you ask me if I was the PE teacher this morning, man? I don't know, Monte said, shrugging his shoulders and looking down at the ragged burgundy school carpet. But Monte did know. He just didn't know how to share his feelings. He was going through a life-changing experience, an experience that hundreds of thousands of kids go their whole lives without enjoying. He didn't know how to tell Mr. Wood that he was different than any of his previous teachers, and that he saw his older brother and father in Mr. Wood. He certainly didn't know how to tell him no one had ever called him King Monte outside of his family. Mr. Wood sighed deeply and lowered his eyebrows. He then looked up at the clock and put his book, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, on top of his desk. He handed Monte a piece of watermelon candy, told him he believed in him, and sent him back to music class. Chapter 9. Invisible Halos. As music class was coming to a close, Mr. Wood peered through the window in the hallway. He had arrived a few minutes before class was dismissed in an attempt to see if his scholars were on task. Nathalie noticed him and shoved Charlotte off of her blue music note, attracting Monte's attention. Look, Mr. Wood's here. Within seconds, the entire class had lost focus on Mrs. Satchmo's spiel about the big band music made popular in the Roaring '20s. Mrs. Satchmo closed her picture book illustrating the cohesion between brass trombones, tenor saxophones, and every instrument you could think of playing as one on stage. Good morning, Mr. Wood. You snuck up on me. I wondered why your class seemed to lose interest in the stories my daddy used to tell me about playing in jazz bands up and down the Mississippi River. I don't think they lost interest, Mrs. Satchmo. Maybe they're just picturing themselves as some of your greatest musicians. Many of the students laughed and agreed. Yep, that's it, Mr. Wood, a boy next to Monte blurted out. With both hands on her hips, Mrs. Satchmo stood before her students and waited for control. I'm looking to see who's ready to be dismissed, boys and girls. All of the children in the classroom immediately crossed their legs and sat upright. They were all on their best behavior since Mr. Wood had entered the room, and Mrs. Satchmo made sure to share her frustrations about their overexcitement to be back with one another now that the summer was over. I'm thinking my young women are ready to be dismissed, Mrs. Satchmo said as she gestured for them to line up at the classroom door. There was a long pause as the teachers towered over the boys who remained crisscross applesauce on their blue music notes. Monte could feel the tension in the room. He glanced around his classmates and found that many of them were avoiding Mr. Wood's eyes. Mr. Wood shifted his weight, crossed his arms, and said aloud to Mrs. Satchmo, Uh-oh, What happened? Mrs. Satchmo crossed her arms as well. I'm guessing your students were just so excited to be back at school that they couldn't stop talking to one another. The boys in particular were just so chatty. Every time I turned around, Richard and Brandon had something to say to one another. Monte looked over his left shoulder to side-eye and shake his head slowly at Brandon. Oh, is that right, Mrs. Satchmo? Mr. Wood said through his teeth, as his eyes pierced through Richard and Brandon's attempt at innocence. Well, I'll be sure to take time away from their recess by talking to them, just as they took time away from your music lesson by talking to one another. The children gasped, sat up a little straighter, and pinched their lips together a little tighter. They all seemed to be wearing invisible halos over their heads to signify their purity. As Mr. Wood's two lines combined outside of the music classroom, a fifth-grade class approached to their left. Who's he? One of the fifth graders hissed under his breath to a student in front of him. Monte followed the student's narrowed eyes. He was looking at Mr. Wood. The other fifth grader shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know, but he sure looks mean. The remainder of the fifth graders in the hallway soon took notice of Mr. Wood as well. They stared at him as if he was from another planet. Monte felt an immediate connection to the fifth graders. He wasn't crazy to think Mr. Wood was out of the ordinary in a school setting. What's up, my man? A bold fifth grader by the name of Rodrigo said to Mr. Wood, holding out his hand as if they were in front of the corner store in the South Side neighborhood. Monte stared at the boy's hand, waiting to see what would happen. After all, Mr. Wood seemed like a cool teacher. He had called Monte man only an hour ago. There was a big difference between an adult calling a kid man and a kid calling an adult man, as though they were neighborhood friends. One was friendly, the other, Monte knew, was disrespectful. But he wasn't quite sure how his teacher would respond. Excuse me? Mr. Wood said. He left the young boy's hand dangling in the air. All of the students in the hallway took part in the awkward silence Mr. Wood created as Rodrigo sucked his teeth and found his place back in line with his peers. Line leader, take us away, Mr. Wood commanded, but before they left, he stepped into Rodrigo's personal space, stooped down to the young man's height, and reached out his right hand to formally shake Rodrigo's. My name is Mr. Wood, and I eat disrespectful children alive.